So when you have people, you need to feed them, and some populations have more access to food than others. And so food security is super important to look at. And so food security, if you look at this little infographic down here, um, is food available? Do they have access to it? And can you actually use the food well? Um, and so all of these things affect how much access someone actually has to food to live a healthy and active life. And so if they don't have that access, then it leads to chronic hunger and malnutrition, which leads to a weakened immune system and ultimately illness and disease. So, having a healthy diet is very important, and you can't have that healthy diet without actually being available to you. And so, I'm sure you can imagine that there are food shortages in the areas you would most expect. Um, and if we were to focus in on our own countries, you would probably see that we actually have food shortages within our own country. But this is a by country map, and so overall, on average, in the US, people really do have plenty of access to food. So, how do we solve this problem of chronic hunger? So, we can promote the economic development of developing countries without the adequate food supplies. Um, so, better economic development will lead to better access to food. We could provide access to food and land resources for them. And another way is to just control the population growth. If there aren't so many people to feed, then there might not be a food security issue. And so, one way that we can help developing countries access their resources so that they can then secure their own food are tools like this. So, this is an interactive map of Africa looking at soil nutrient availability. If you look down here, so we can actually see where the soil is actually in pretty good shape, and then use those areas to plant in hopefully sustainable ways. And so ultimately, we would like to, decrease our population growth. And so, is it possible to get to zero population growth? Well, I mean, obviously, there are a few ways that we can try and go about getting there. Um, and in looking at these countries with very high population growth, we want to try and delay the age of the first childbearing women, which we've talked about in class, access to birth control, looking at the biological and social issues. So, breastfeeding, um, abstinence, induction of sterility with natural agents, and then contraceptive devices, which goes up into birth control. And so, looking at the way that people see these issues is very important to trying to slow down population growth. And so there are national programs to reduce birth rates, um, formal family planning programs that can help reduce population growth, but can also be very controversial. And so, some solutions: force government programs to reduce population. We'll talk about China in just a moment. Voluntary programs or incentive based family programs. Um, allow or helping the economy, so higher GNP, better education, health facilities, gender equality will all help slow down population growth. And then sterilization, so tubal ligation, getting your tubes tied, vasectomies, and then promotion of contraceptive use, so family planning and birth control. So here's China, the largest population in the world, and they have this super controversial family planning policy. Um, they started looking at birth control, and then they started incentives to promote people to get married later and to only have one child. And so these incentives included medical care, schooling for their child, preferential housing. And so that actually brought about a pretty drastic decrease in fertility. So, fertility being the number of children that a woman has. And in 1980, China instituted their one child policy. So it was very controversial, and really it compromised the freedom of choice of the individual. And so there's a lot of pressure to abort a second child if that pregnancy happened. And because people were only allowed to have one child, there's actually a lot of pressure to abort or kill or give away for adoption the first female child, because it is a very man centered culture in China. And so now, as we go move forward, there are a lot more boys than girls in China, actually. And so that leads to an issue in and of itself. If there aren't enough women in the country to actually reproduce. And so things are a little more relaxed in rural China, but if you're in a city, for sure, only one child. Um, so now, just recently in 2016, China instituted their two-child policy. And so if a parent is an only child or their first child suffers from some sort of disability, they're allowed to have two children now. Women are required to wear an IUD after the first child is born. Um, so they are actually forcing birth control, and couples are punished for refusing to terminate unapproved pregnancies. And so there are lots of fines, loss of land, given less food, loss of government benefits. And so doctors also are given bonuses for sterilizing women. In India, there's also there's also a huge population. And so there is government sponsored family planning. They introduced incentives, sometimes mandatory sterilization as well. And now the government is actually focusing on education. Um, so they're giving away free condoms and tubal ligation, so getting your tubes tied. But still, total fertility rate is still above the replacement level, um, even though, you know, it is very effective. And finally, in Nigeria, this is the largest population of any African country, and they have a very high reproductive potential because a lot of the population is less than 15 years of age. And as they age up, they'll come into their reproductive years. And so their national population policy is actually through education and improving healthcare. And that concludes our PowerPoint.